as Canada continues to battle the second wave of the pandemic, with Ontario officially in a province-wide lockdown as of Boxing Day. Canadian businesses continue to struggle to survive this historic blow to our economy. Well, joining me now is Philip Cross, MLI Munk Senior Fellow. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me back. My pleasure.
So let's start by highlighting the key findings in MLI's recent report.
Well, the major finding is that we continue to find that the government support during the pandemic was much easier and much more aimed at households than it was the business sector. And that's reflected in the savings data you noted earlier. Households were able to sock away well over $600 billion in the first 3 quarters of the year. Firms barely broke even.
And now the financial disparity between net household incomes and savings for corporations was huge, $686.4 billion versus just $14.1 billion. Why such a big difference?
Well, savings reflects both income and spending. And we saw for households, household income in Canada rose more than any other major nation. Government just pushed money out the door into households. At the same time, households didn't spend a lot of that money. So the savings rate jumped to an historic high of 30%, remained very high. And that reflects that a lot of this money went to people who really didn't need it. I mean, obviously, if all the money was going to low-income people who lost their jobs, they would have spent most of it. But a lot of this money ended up going to better off people, and they didn't need the money. And ultimately, this money ended up working its way into the housing and stock market. Meanwhile, corporations, they were seeing a frightful decline in their business. A lot of them had to shutter altogether, and their spending didn't fall as much, so they weren't able to save money. So that's why we saw this sharp discrepancy between the two sectors.
And how does federal aid for businesses compare to that being provided to Canadian individuals?
Well, we've seen quite a stark difference all along. In particular, we saw with households, it was basically no questions asked. Just come up and we'll give you $2,000 a month. And as a result, the government ended up writing much larger checks for CERB than they expected. Meanwhile, the wage subsidy program, especially that was aimed towards business, initially that was only going to pay 10% in the first month. And so a lot of businesses didn't have any interest. A lot of the other government programs for business, such as rent aid, were complete flops. So we saw a huge demand, household demand, a much greater response than expected, and a much lower response from business. So clearly that tells you how these programs were designed.
Now, we know the pandemic has left no business untouched, but what businesses were hit the hardest during this pandemic, sir?
Well, the usual suspects were, of course, transportation, particularly air travel, accommodation and food, personal services. But often overlooked is how hard business services were hit. We have all these, office towers sitting in downtowns across the nation that are empty. So we don't need security guards. We don't need caterers. We don't need cleaning staff. So business services that take care of these buildings have been really hard hit as well.
Now, I know that the CERB was meant to help Canadians get through the pandemic financially and help curb people who were laid off. But what effects has this program had on unemployment in general in Canada?
Well, it's capped the way that my former colleagues at StatCan measure unemployment, because a lot of people, because they weren't under any stress, they didn't feel the need to do anything but sit at home and collect CERB checks, they just dropped out of the labor force. And when you're not looking for a job, when you're just sitting at home and dropped out of the labor force, Statistics Canada says, well, you're not unemployed because you're not looking for a job. You may have lost your job, but you're not unemployed. So we saw a much smaller increase in unemployment than we would have expected given the very sharp drop in jobs. So there's a lot of people out there who just weren't looking. And as a result, that's why we're in this curious situation where a lot of people have lost their jobs, and yet a lot of businesses say they can't find workers.
All right, Mr. Cross, we are out of time for this segment, but thank you again for your time today, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.